In the autumn of 1871, a routine property dispute in rural Pennsylvania exposed one of the most disturbing medical conspiracies in American history. When county officials arrived at the settlement of Harmonia Springs to serve eviction papers, they found 23 abandoned houses, a medical facility with files documenting 15 years of systematic human experimentation, and graves, so many graves, containing children whose skeletal remains showed deformities that local physicians had never seen before. Among the scattered documents was the journal of Sarah Brennan, whose final entry contained 5 words that would haunt investigators for decades: "We were brother and sister." What happened in Harmonia Springs between 1856 and 1871 was so methodically evil that 3 separate congressional inquiries tried to bury the evidence, claiming the knowledge itself posed a threat to public morality. Before we continue with the story of Harmonia Springs, if you're fascinated by America's darkest historical secrets, subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. You might be closer to these events than you think. The settlement that would become known as Harmonia Springs began not with horror, but with hope. The kind of desperate hope that makes people willing to believe impossible promises. The year was 1856, and Pennsylvania was experiencing one of its most tumultuous periods. The Industrial Revolution had left thousands of workers displaced, injured, and destitute. Coal mining accidents were claiming lives weekly in the anthracite fields of Schuylkill County, and the medical establishment, still decades away from understanding basic hygiene, could offer little help to the broken bodies that emerged from the mines. Factory workers in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh lost fingers to machinery, developed respiratory diseases from cotton dust, and died young from exhaustion. It was into this landscape of desperation that Dr. Cornelius Engelhardt arrived with what seemed like a miracle. Dr. Engelhardt wasn't like the other physicians of Lancaster County. While they practiced bloodletting and prescribed mercury for everything from headaches to hysteria, Engelhardt spoke of revolutionary treatments from the great medical schools of Vienna and Berlin. He was 43 years old, stood 6 feet tall with prematurely white hair that gave him an air of distinction, and possessed a manner of speaking that made even the most skeptical farmers lean forward to listen. His credentials were impressive: graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, class of 1835, trained under the famous physiologists of Europe, including a year with Rudolf Virchow in Berlin, published in journals that nobody in rural Pennsylvania had heard of, but which sounded tremendously important. He first appeared in Lancaster in the spring of 1856, staying at the White Swan Inn on King Street. Local doctors remembered him attending their medical society meetings, where he would listen politely to their discussions of humoral theory before standing to deliver passionate speeches about the new science of heredity. He spoke of Gregor Mendel's work with pea plants, though Mendel's papers wouldn't be widely known for another decade. He described theories of bloodline purification that he claimed were being tested in the finest European sanitariums. Most compelling of all, he had money, enough to purchase 800 acres of prime farmland without negotiating the price. The land he chose was along Conewago Creek, about 15 miles northwest of Lancaster proper. It had belonged to the Hare family for 3 generations, but crop failures and debt had forced them to sell. The location was perfect for Engelhardt's purposes, isolated enough to avoid the prying eyes of conventional medical authorities, yet accessible by the newly constructed railroad line that connected Lancaster to Harrisburg. The property included a natural spring that bubbled up from limestone bedrock, its water carrying a slight sulfur smell that Engelhardt claimed had therapeutic properties. Within months, construction began. Engelhardt hired German and Irish workers from Lancaster, paying them well above typical wages, but requiring them to sign contracts promising silence about what they were building. The main medical facility was a 3-story brick building with a distinctive cupola larger than most hospitals of the era. Surrounding it, arranged in a perfect geometric pattern that Engelhardt insisted was essential for harmonic living, were sites for 36 houses, each identical in design. 2 stories, 4 rooms downstairs, 4 rooms upstairs, with modern conveniences like indoor pumps for water and advanced ventilation systems. The first families arrived in March of 1857, still wearing winter coats against the late cold snap that had frozen the creek solid. They were carefully selected. Engelhardt had placed advertisements in German-language newspapers throughout Pennsylvania, seeking families of good moral character afflicted by hereditary ailments. Revolutionary medical treatment offered at no cost. Room, board, and employment provided. Children especially welcome for preventive care. The responses had been overwhelming. Desperate letters poured in from across the state, parents describing children with clubfoot, hair lips, seizures, mental deficiencies, and countless other ailments that 19th-century medicine couldn't cure. Engelhardt personally reviewed each application, though his selection criteria seemed mysterious. He rejected a wealthy merchant family from Philadelphia while accepting the destitute Zimmermans from Berks County. He turned away a war veteran with a missing arm, but welcomed the Grabers, whose daughter Anna suffered from periodic seizures that left her unconscious for hours. The Zimmerman family, Johannes, his wife Catherine, and their 4 children, arrived first. Their youngest son, Peter, had been born with severe rickets that left his legs grotesquely bowed. Johannes had spent everything they had on treatments that didn't work. Cod liver oil, special braces forged by a blacksmith, even a painful surgery in Philadelphia that only made things worse. When Engelhardt examined Peter, running his hands along the boy's twisted bones with a gentleness that made Catherine weep, he proclaimed that the child's condition was entirely curable through proper nutrition and his revolutionary bone-stretching apparatus. The Grabers came next, their wagon loaded with the few possessions they hadn't sold to pay for Anna's treatments. She was 16, pretty, despite the exhaustion that lined her face, and had been suffering seizures since she was 12. The local minister in Lebanon had suggested the fits were divine punishment for some hidden sin, which had driven her father Jacob to near violence. Engelhardt dismissed such superstition with a wave of his hand. Anna's condition, he explained, was merely an electrical imbalance in the brain that could be corrected through carefully calibrated galvanic treatments. By summer, 15 families had taken residence in Harmonia Springs. The Hirschbergers from York County, whose 3 children all showed signs of what Engelhardt called hereditary mental weakness. The Yoders from Chester County, fleeing the shame of a daughter born with a cleft palate so severe that townspeople crossed themselves when they saw her. The Stoltz-Fuses, the Weavers, the Pennypackers, the Grabers. Each family brought their own burden of suffering and their desperate hope that this strange doctor with his revolutionary theories could provide salvation. What made Engelhardt's offer irresistible wasn't just the promise of revolutionary medical treatment. He offered something even more precious in those uncertain times: dignity. In Harmonia Springs, their children wouldn't be stared at or whispered about. They wouldn't be called cursed or demon-touched. They would be patients, subjects of scientific study, pioneers in the advancement of medical knowledge. The parents, many of whom had been reduced to begging or charity, were given meaningful work. The men labored in the settlement's workshops and fields, the women tended gardens and helped with medical care, and everyone received a small wage plus their housing and food. The early months seemed to validate every promise. The spring water, rich in minerals, did seem to help with certain ailments. Children who had arrived pale and listless began showing color in their cheeks. Peter Zimmerman's legs, subjected daily to Engelhardt's stretching machine and special exercises, began to straighten slightly. Anna Graber's seizures became less frequent after her galvanic treatments. The Yoder girl's cleft palate was surgically repaired by Engelhardt himself in a procedure that, while primitive by later standards, was remarkably advanced for 1857. But there were rules in Harmonia Springs, strict rules that Engelhardt insisted were essential to the treatment process. Families were discouraged from leaving the settlement except for essential business, and even then, they needed Engelhardt's written permission. Mail was collected and distributed through Englehart's office, supposedly to prevent the stress of bad news from interfering with recovery. Visitors were strictly prohibited unless approved in advance, ostensibly to prevent the introduction of disease. Most significantly, Englehart instituted what he called the Program of Hereditary Optimization. Every Tuesday evening, the entire community gathered in the meeting hall for Englehart's lectures. He would stand at the podium, charts and diagrams behind him, and explain his theories with the passion of a revivalist preacher. Most human ailments, he proclaimed, were caused by what he termed bloodline contamination, the mixing of incompatible hereditary essences through generations of unscientific breeding. The first wedding in Harmonia Springs took place on September 15, 1858, over a year after the settlement's founding. The delay had been intentional. Englehart insisted he needed time to complete his hereditary analyses to map out the optimal pairings that would produce healthy offspring. The chosen couple was Sarah Graber, now 18 years old, and William Brennan, 21. Their match, Englehart proclaimed to the gathered community, represented the perfect confluence of complementary hereditary factors. Sarah had flourished in Harmonia Springs. Her seizures, which had plagued her for years, had stopped completely after 6 months of treatment. She had gained weight, her cheeks were rosy, and she moved with a grace that had been impossible when fits could strike at any moment. She worked in the settlement school, helping Charlotte Pennypacker teach the younger children their letters and numbers. In the evenings, she would sit with her parents on their porch, her mother Elizabeth braiding her long auburn hair, while her father Jacob read from the Bible in his steady, comforting voice. William Brennan's transformation had been equally remarkable. He had arrived at Harmonia Springs in the summer of 1857, brought by a distant relative who had heard of Englehart's work. William's story was tragic. Orphaned at 7 when his parents died in what he'd been told was a cholera outbreak in Philadelphia, raised by an aunt in Chester County who could barely afford to feed him. He had suffered from chronic respiratory ailments that left him gasping for breath, unable to work more than a few hours without collapsing in exhaustion. Under Englehart's care, with daily treatments involving vapor inhalation and chest percussion, he had become strong enough to work full days in the settlement's carpentry shop. The courtship, such as it was, had been carefully orchestrated by Englehart. He assigned Sarah and William to work together on settlement projects, cataloging the medical library, maintaining the herb garden, teaching Sunday school to the youngest children. He noted in his private journal how they began to seek each other's company, how William would save the best pieces of lumber to make small gifts for Sarah, how she would bring him special treats from her mother's kitchen. When Englehart announced their engagement at a Tuesday lecture, he presented it as a triumph of scientific matching. He showed charts indicating their complementary physical characteristics, graphs demonstrating the likelihood of healthy offspring, even phrenological measurements suggesting perfect temperamental compatibility. The other families, desperate to believe in Englehart's vision, celebrated the match. Here was proof that their children could have normal lives, could marry and prosper despite their ailments. The wedding day dawned clear and cool, unusual for September in Pennsylvania. The women of the settlement had been preparing for weeks. Frau Zimmermann had sewn Sarah's dress from white cotton that Englehart had specially ordered from Philadelphia, incorporating tiny seed pearls that caught the light when she moved. The Hirschberger women had baked enough pastries to feed twice their number, using precious sugar and flour that represented a significant portion of the settlement's resources. Even the children, many bearing visible signs of their various ailments, had been dressed in their finest clothes and instructed in proper wedding behavior. The ceremony took place in the meeting hall, which had been transformed with garlands of late summer flowers, goldenrod, asters, and chrysanthemums from the settlement's gardens. Englehart himself performed the ceremony. He had obtained ministerial credentials through the Church of Human Perfectibility, an obscure denomination that none of the German Lutheran or Reformed families had heard of. But his words about the sacred nature of marriage and the blessing of children moved many to tears. Charlotte Pennypacker played the small organ that had been donated by a Lancaster benefactor, filling the hall with hymns that echoed off the wooden rafters. Sarah entered on her father's arm, radiant in her white dress, her hair crowned with a wreath of white roses from her mother's garden. William stood at the altar in a new black suit that the settlement's tailor had made specially for the occasion, his hands trembling slightly as he watched his bride approach. The vows they exchanged were traditional, with one addition that Engelhardt had insisted upon. After promising to love, honor, and cherish, both Sarah and William pledged to honor the sacred principles of hereditary science and raise their children according to the laws of natural optimization. At the time, it seemed merely another of Engelhardt's eccentricities, no more unusual than his insistence on daily mineral baths or his prohibition of certain foods he deemed hereditary contaminated. That evening, as the celebration continued in the meeting hall with dancing and feasting, Engelhardt retired to his office to make a special entry in his private journal. The primary phase of Experiment Series 3 has been successfully initiated. Subjects 3A, SG, and 3B, WB have been joined in matrimony without suspicion of their true relationship. Both subjects remain entirely unaware that they share the same parentage, specifically that they are fraternal twins separated at 13 months of age. Their physical differences, developed through disparate upbringing conditions, have prevented recognition of their familial resemblance. The next phase, reproduction, will provide crucial data on the effects of pure bloodline concentration. I anticipate the first offspring within 12 to 18 months. The newlyweds were given a house on the eastern edge of the settlement, a modest two-story structure with a view of the creek. William had spent weeks preparing it, crafting furniture with his own hands, including a beautiful cradle that he placed optimistically in the upstairs bedroom. Sarah arranged their few possessions with care, hanging curtains her mother had sewn, placing her Bible on the bedside table, setting William's tools in neat rows in his workshop. They were young, in love, and believed they were beginning a blessed life together. The first signs of trouble came quickly. Sarah became pregnant within 2 months of the wedding, which Engelhardt proclaimed as evidence of their excellent hereditary compatibility. But the pregnancy was difficult from the start. She suffered from constant nausea that no remedy could cure, debilitating headaches that left her bedridden for days, and strange episodes where she would stare at nothing for hours, unresponsive to William's increasingly frantic attempts to rouse her. Thomas Brennan was born on June 21, 1859, as summer solstice bathed Harmonia Springs in the longest light of the year. But there was no light in the birthing room where Sarah labored for 36 hours, her screams echoing across the settlement. Charlotte Pennypacker, serving as midwife, knew something was wrong the moment the baby crowned. The head was too large, grotesquely so, and misshapen in a way that made her hands tremble as she guided the infant into the world. The child that emerged was a study in abnormality. His skull was elongated, almost cone-shaped, with a visible ridge running along the top. His eyes, one brown like Sarah's, one grey-green like William's, seemed to track movement independently of each other, giving him an unsettling, unfocused gaze. Most disturbing were his hands. The fingers were fused together at birth, creating paddle-like appendages that Charlotte had to carefully separate with a scalpel while the baby screamed. Engelhardt's reaction to Thomas's birth was not the concern one would expect from a physician. Instead, he showed excitement, almost glee, measuring the infant's skull with calipers, documenting every abnormality in detailed notes, taking measurements that he recorded in charts only he understood. He assured the distraught parents that these were merely variations in hereditary expression that would normalize with proper treatment. He prescribed a regimen of skull massage, electrical stimulation, and special feeding formulas that he prepared himself in his laboratory. Other births in Harmonia Springs during 1859 and 1860 showed similar patterns of abnormality. The Zimmerman twins, Eva and Emma, were born in January 1860 with matching spinal deformities that caused them constant pain. Their cries, a horrible keening that never seemed to stop, could be heard throughout the settlement at night. The Yoda's son, born that spring, had a cleft palate so severe he couldn't nurse properly and had to be fed through a tube Engelhart inserted directly into his stomach. The Hirschberger baby girl had limbs that bent at impossible angles, her joints seeming to work in reverse. But it was the pattern of deaths that began to reveal the true horror. Of the 12 children born in Harmonia Springs between 1859 and 1861, 7 died before their first birthday. The causes listed on death certificates were vague: hereditary insufficiency, constitutional weakness, failure to thrive. The small cemetery on the hillside above the settlement began to fill with tiny headstones, most bearing dates that spanned only weeks or months. Parents gathered at these graves in the evening twilight, when Engelhart's assistants were less likely to observe them. They would whisper their fears to each other, wondering if the treatments were somehow causing these problems rather than curing them. But always, Engelhart had explanations. The children's conditions were caused by generations of hereditary contamination that couldn't be corrected in a single generation. It would take time, patience, and continued breeding to achieve the perfection he sought. Sarah's second pregnancy, beginning in late 1860, was even worse than the first. She suffered from hallucinations, claiming to see children who weren't there, hearing voices calling her name from empty rooms. William would find her standing at the window at night, staring at nothing, tears streaming down her face. When he asked what was wrong, she would say she didn't know, that she felt as if something fundamental was broken inside her, as if her body was rejecting itself. Margaret Brennan was born on March 15, 1861, as the nation descended into civil war. She lived for only 3 months, her body simply unable to sustain life despite Engelhart's increasingly desperate interventions. The child's deformities were so severe that Charlotte Pennypacker, hardened by years of witnessing medical horrors, wept as she wrapped the tiny body for burial. The official cause of death was listed as hereditary insufficiency, but Charlotte noted privately that the child's internal organs seemed to be arranged incorrectly, as if nature itself had become confused in forming her. The Civil War, raging beyond their isolated valley, provided Engelhart with unexpected opportunities. He began receiving shipments of orphans from battlefield areas, children whose parents had supposedly been killed in the fighting. These children, he explained to the settlement, would be raised in their wholesome environment and eventually integrated into the hereditary optimization program. What the residents didn't know was that many of these children weren't orphans at all, but had been purchased or taken from desperate families, selected for specific physical characteristics that Engelhart believed would enhance his breeding program. Among these supposed orphans were 2 children who arrived in the summer of 1865. Daniel, aged 7, and Rebecca, aged 5. They came separately, Daniel in June and Rebecca in August, both supposedly from families killed in the fighting around Gettysburg. Daniel was placed with the Stoltzfus family, who had recently lost their own son to one of the mysterious fevers that periodically swept through the settlement's children. Rebecca went to live with the Weavers on the opposite side of the settlement. Engelhart insisted that the children be kept apart, claiming that survivors of such trauma needed to form new attachments rather than dwelling on shared memories of loss. But Charlotte Pennypacker noticed something odd in Engelhart's records. Both children were listed with the same coded designation, specimen group 7 paired. When she questioned this, Engelhart became furious, accusing her of overstepping her position and threatening to dismiss her from the settlement. Charlotte had been with Engelhart since the beginning, recruited from Philadelphia where she had trained as a nurse at Pennsylvania Hospital. She was 35, unmarried, and had devoted her life to medicine at a time when few women were permitted such careers. Initially, she had been impressed by Engelhart's theories, his talk of using science to eliminate human suffering. But as the years passed and she witnessed the mounting horror of malformed children and grieving parents, her faith in his mission had crumbled. Late at night, when Engelhart was occupied with his experiments in the medical facility's basement laboratory, Charlotte began her own investigation. She copied his records, creating a secret archive hidden beneath loose floorboards in her quarters. She traced the origins of the orphans, finding purchase orders from poorhouses, bills of sale that referred to children as specimens, correspondence with other doctors conducting similar experiments in other states. The spring of 1868 brought two events that would begin to unravel Engelhart's carefully constructed deception. The first was an outbreak of what Engelhart called hereditary fever, but was almost certainly a combination of measles and scarlet fever that arrived with a new family from Harrisburg. In a normal community, such diseases would have been serious but manageable. In Harmonia Springs, where years of inbreeding had produced children with virtually no immune resistance, it was catastrophic. The fever struck the children first, as such diseases always do. Little Eva Zimmerman was the first to fall ill, her already fragile body racked with fever and covered in a rash that looked like burns. Within days, her twin Emma showed the same symptoms. Then the Yoder children, the Hirschberger baby, Thomas Brennan. One by one, the children of Harmonia Springs fell ill. Engelhart's response was to quarantine the sick children in the medical facility, claiming he needed to prevent the spread of contamination. Parents were forbidden from visiting, told that emotional distress would interfere with treatment. But Charlotte, who was tasked with caring for the children, saw the truth. Engelhart was using the outbreak as an opportunity for more experiments, testing various compounds on the dying children, documenting their suffering with clinical detachment. 17 children died in 3 weeks. The youngest was barely 6 months old, the eldest just 8 years. The bodies were wrapped in white sheets and buried in a mass grave that Engelhart insisted was necessary to prevent the spread of disease. Parents who had already buried multiple children now weren't even allowed to say goodbye to their dead. The grief that descended on Harmonia Springs was like a physical weight pressing down on every household. It was Jacob Zimmerman who finally snapped. He had lost all 4 of his children to the fever, including the twins whose birth had been so difficult and whose short lives had been nothing but suffering. On the night of May 15, 1868, he broke into Engelhart's office through a window, determined to find answers. He had always been a methodical man. Before coming to Harmonia Springs, he had worked as a bookkeeper for a Lancaster merchant, and those skills served him now as he systematically searched through Engelhart's files. The first ledger he opened seemed ordinary enough. Medical records, treatment notes, observations about patient progress. But as he read deeper, the clinical language began to reveal its true meaning. Subject breeding pairs were listed with code numbers rather than names. Hereditary confluence achieved appeared next to dates that corresponded with weddings in the settlement. Most chilling were the entries about redundant specimens, children who had died or been born with deformities too severe to survive. Then Jacob found the master chart, a massive genealogical diagram that covered an entire wall when unfolded. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard family tree of the settlement's residents. But as his eyes traced the connecting lines, he realized with growing horror that the same names appeared in multiple places, connected by different colored lines that seemed to indicate different relationships. Sarah Graber and William Brennan were connected not just as husband and wife, marked in blue, but by another line, marked in red, that led back to a common origin point labeled only as Specimen Group 3, Twin Separation Experiment. His hands shaking, Jacob pulled out more documents from a locked drawer he had pried open. Adoption records from poor houses across Pennsylvania, but with notes in Engelhart's hand. Male child, approximately 18 months, strong Saxon features, suitable for Group 3 breeding. Female infant, parentage unknown, physical markers consistent with Group 3 requirements. Purchase orders for children, actual purchase orders, with prices listed in dollars and cents, as if they were livestock. And then, the most damning evidence of all, original birth certificates hidden behind false ones, showing that children who had been placed in different families, who had grown up believing they were orphans from different towns, were actually siblings. Sarah Graber and William Brennan, according to a birth certificate from Philadelphia dated March 3, 1840, were twins born to a woman named Mary Elizabeth Brennan. They had been separated at 13 months and sold to different families who had been paid to maintain the fiction of their origins. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Jacob freeze. He quickly folded the most important documents and stuffed them inside his coat, then slipped out through the window. But Engelhardt had already noticed the disturbance. A lamp left burning, papers slightly out of place. The next morning, he announced that Jacob Zimmerman had suffered a breakdown due to grief and had been taken to the state asylum in Harrisburg for treatment. Catherine Zimmerman, already destroyed by the loss of her children, was told her husband had attacked Engelhardt in his madness, and that commitment was the only alternative to criminal charges. No one in the settlement ever saw Jacob again. Months later, Catherine would receive a letter supposedly from the asylum stating that her husband had died of brain fever. The letter was in Engelhardt's handwriting, though she was too broken to notice or care. Charlotte Pennypacker had watched Jacob enter the office from her window, had seen him flee with papers stuffed in his coat. She knew her time was running out. That night she gathered her own collection of copied documents and prepared to act. But first, she had one more task to complete. She had to warn Sarah Brennan. Charlotte arrived at Sarah's house just after sunset on May 20th, 1868. Sarah was alone. William had been spending his nights in the workshop, unable to bear being in the house where two of their children had died. Thomas, now 9 years old, was asleep upstairs, his labored breathing audible even from the parlor. Sarah was 6 months pregnant with her fourth child, her body swollen and exhausted, her face bearing the hollow look of someone who had endured too much grief. "I need to tell you something," Charlotte whispered, glancing nervously at the windows. "About your husband, about both of you, about what Dr. Engelhardt has done." Sarah's first instinct was to refuse to listen. She had survived this long by not asking questions, by accepting Engelhardt's explanations, by believing that her children's deformities were God's will or nature's cruelty rather than something more sinister. But Charlotte's urgency, the documents she pulled from her bag, the tears streaming down the older woman's face, all of it broke through Sarah's defenses. Charlotte showed her the birth certificate first. Mary Elizabeth Brennan, mother. Twin births, one male, one female. March 3rd, 1840. Philadelphia General Hospital. Then the adoption records. 2 different families, 2 different stories, but the same date of placement, the same signature on both documents. Dr. Cornelius Engelhardt. "You and William are twins," Charlotte said, gripping Sarah's hands as the younger woman began to shake. "Engelhardt separated you as babies, placed you with different families, and then brought you back together to marry. Your children's deformities. It's because you share the same blood. You're not just husband and wife, you're brother and sister." Sarah's reaction was not the hysteria Charlotte had expected. Instead, she became very still, her hands moving to her swollen belly, where another child, another product of this abomination, was growing. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I think I always knew something was wrong. The way Thomas looks, he has William's eyes exactly. Not just similar. Exactly the same. And Margaret, before she died, her hands were identical to mine, down to the birthmark on the smallest finger. Even the way William laughs, it's the same sound I make. I thought it was because we were meant to be together, that God had made us perfectly matched, but it wasn't God, was it?" Over the following weeks, the truth spread through Harmonia Springs like a contagion. Charlotte had shared her documents with Sarah, who told Mary Yoder when she came to help with the housework. Mary told her sister-in-law, who told the Weaver women during washing day. Each revelation brought new horrors to light. The Stoltzfus family discovered that their 3 adopted children were all siblings. The Hirschbergers learned that the cousin they had taken in was actually their own son, taken at birth and returned to them years later as an orphan. William discovered the truth when he found Sarah burning their marriage certificate in the kitchen stove. She told him everything, showed him Charlotte's documents, watched as the color drained from his face. He ran outside and vomited in the garden, then collapsed to his knees, sobbing. When he finally returned to the house, he couldn't look at her, he couldn't look at Thomas. He moved into the workshop permanently, leaving Sarah alone with their son and her pregnancy. Daniel and Rebecca, the young orphans who had arrived in 1865, had grown into teenagers by 1870. Now 15 and 13, they had begun to notice each other, despite Engelhardt's efforts to keep them apart. They would meet secretly in the old barn, where winter supplies were stored, drawn together by something neither could explain. As they talked, sharing fragmented memories of their early childhood, the truth became undeniable. They both remembered a house with blue shutters, a woman who sang German lullabies, the smell of bread baking on Sunday mornings. They were brother and sister, and Engelhardt had been preparing them for the same fate as the Brennans. The settlement began to fracture. Some families attempted to flee, only to be brought back by Engelhardt's assistants, rough men from Philadelphia, who had no medical training but plenty of experience with violence. The Yodas made it as far as Lancaster before being caught and returned. Abraham Yoda's blackened eye and his wife's split lip sent a clear message to anyone else considering escape. Others turned to more desperate measures. Mary Stoltzfus, unable to live with the knowledge that she had married her brother and borne 3 deformed children, walked into Conewago Creek with stones sewn into her dress pockets. Her body was found 3 miles downstream, and Engelhardt listed the cause of death as accidental drowning. Her husband Hans stopped speaking entirely, spending his days sitting by the window, staring at nothing. Engelhardt's behavior grew increasingly erratic. His lectures became rambling diatribes about racial purity and the necessity of sacrifice for scientific progress. He spoke of expanding the experiment, creating satellite communities across Pennsylvania where his theories could be implemented on a larger scale. He had begun corresponding with like-minded physicians in Ohio and Indiana, sharing his methods and encouraging them to establish their own breeding programs. Charlotte knew she had to act. She contacted Frederick Schaefer, a journalist from the Lancaster Examiner who had been investigating rumors of medical malpractice in rural communities. She arranged to meet him at a tavern 10 miles from Harmonia Springs, carrying with her a satchel full of copied documents that would expose everything. She never made it to the meeting. Charlotte's body was found in a ravine 2 days later, her neck broken in what Engelhardt declared was a tragic fall. The documents she carried were never recovered, but Frederick Schaefer was not easily deterred. Charlotte had managed to mail him some preliminary information before her death, enough to convince him that something terrible was happening in Harmonia Springs. In early April 1871, as spring brought new life to the Pennsylvania countryside, a woman calling herself Elizabeth Morrison arrived in Lancaster. She was 53 years old, her face weathered by years of factory work, her hands scarred from decades at the textile mills. She took a room at the White Swan Inn, the same establishment where Engelhardt had stayed 15 years earlier, and began making inquiries about Harmonia Springs. She was methodical in her investigation, visiting the county courthouse to examine property records, talking to merchants who supplied the settlement, even attending the medical society meetings where Engelhardt's name was mentioned in hushed tones. She learned about the isolation of the community, the children with deformities, the families who never left, the death of Charlotte Pennypacker. Each piece of information confirmed what she had suspected for 15 years. Elizabeth Morrison was not her real name. She was Mary Elizabeth Brennan, and she had been searching for her stolen twins since 1841. The story she had been told 30 years ago was that her children had died of cholera while she was working a 16-hour shift at the mill. She had been shown death certificates, had even been taken to small graves in a pauper's cemetery. But a mother's instinct knew better. The bodies had been buried in closed caskets due to the contagion. The death certificates had been signed by a Dr. C. Engelhardt, a name that meant nothing to her then, but had haunted her dreams ever since. For 15 years she had saved every penny she could, learned to read and write, studied legal documents, traced Dr. Engelhardt's career through medical journals and newspaper articles. She had discovered his theories about hereditary optimization, his connections to a network of doctors conducting similar experiments. She had found records of children purchased from poorhouses, bills of sale that referred to human beings as specimens. And finally, through a sympathetic clerk in Philadelphia, who remembered the unusual case of twins being adopted separately on the same day, she had traced her children to Harmonia Springs. On April 15, 1871, Elizabeth arrived at the settlement's gates. She had prepared carefully for this moment, creating a false identity as a distant relative of the Brennan family, complete with forged documents about an inheritance in Ohio that required William's signature. Engelhart, suspicious but greedy, allowed her to enter the community under close supervision. The first time she saw William, her heart nearly stopped. He was working in the carpentry shop, his back to her, but she knew him instantly. The way he held his shoulders, the slight tilt of his head when concentrating, even the way his hair curled at the nape of his neck. It was her father's posture, her father's hair. When he turned and she saw his face, she had to grip the doorframe to keep from crying out. Those were her mother's eyes, her own brother's nose. This was her son, her baby boy, now a grown man worn down by unimaginable horror. Engelhart's assistant, a brutish man named Roth, stood beside her throughout the visit. She played her role perfectly, discussing the fictional inheritance, showing fabricated documents, expressing concern for her nephew's welfare. William barely responded, his eyes hollow, his voice monotone. He kept glancing toward a house on the eastern edge of the settlement, where a pregnant woman stood in the doorway, watching them with obvious anxiety. That night, Elizabeth snuck out of the community hall where she had been assigned quarters. She had observed the patterns of the guards, noted that they grew lazy after midnight, relying more on the settlement's isolation than actual vigilance. She made her way to Sarah's house, her heart pounding with each step. When Sarah opened the door, Elizabeth nearly gasped. It was like looking at herself 30 years ago. The same auburn hair she'd had before the factory work turned it grey, the same delicate features, the same way of tilting her head when confused. This was her daughter, her baby girl, heavy with child and bearing the exhausted look of someone who had endured unthinkable suffering. "Please," Elizabeth whispered urgently, "let me in." "I'm not who I claim to be. I have something to tell you about your past, about William's past, about who you really are." Sarah, too tired and broken to resist, stepped aside. In the dim light of a single candle, Elizabeth told her everything. How she had been a young widow, 23 years old, working in a Philadelphia textile mill for pennies a day. How her husband had died in a factory accident, leaving her with infant twins and no way to support them. How a well-dressed doctor had come to her tenement, claiming to represent a charitable organization that placed orphans with wealthy families. "He said you would have better lives," Elizabeth wept, holding Sarah's hands. "He said you would be educated, cared for, given opportunities I could never provide. I was to get you back when I was financially stable. I signed papers I couldn't read. When I returned 2 weeks later with the first payment I'd saved, you were gone. The office was empty. No one would tell me anything." She pulled out a locket she had worn for 30 years, opening it to reveal a tiny painting. 2 infants, barely a year old, one with darker hair, one lighter, but both with the same distinctive eyes. "I had this made before he took you. It cost me a week's wages, but I needed something to remember you by. Look at the eyes. Do you see? They're William's eyes. They're your eyes." Sarah began to sob, great heaving sobs that brought William running from the workshop where he had been unable to sleep. When he saw his mother, their mother, the recognition was instant despite the years and hardship that separated them. The shape of her hands, the sound of her voice, something deep and primal that recognized its source. "My babies," Elizabeth whispered, pulling both of them into her arms. "My beautiful babies. What has he done to you?" But their reunion was witnessed. Young Daniel, the teenage orphan, had been sneaking out to meet Rebecca and saw the three of them through the window. Not understanding what he was seeing but knowing it was important, he ran to tell the only adult he trusted, old Heinrich Weaver, who had been growing increasingly suspicious of Engelhardt's work. Within an hour, word had spread through the settlement. Families emerged from their houses despite the late hour and the strict rules against assembly. They gathered in the common area, their voices rising from whispers to shouts. Someone rang the meeting hall bell, its bronze voice echoing across the valley. Engelhardt appeared in the doorway of the medical facility, no longer the confident doctor but a cornered animal. He held a pistol in one hand and what appeared to be a bottle of chloroform in the other. Behind him stood his three remaining assistants, all armed. "Return to your homes immediately," he shouted. "This assembly is illegal. You are spreading hereditary contamination through proximity." It was Elizabeth who stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of a mother whose children had been stolen. "Tell them the truth, Engelhardt. Tell them what you've done. Tell them that you've been making brothers marry sisters, that you've been breeding human beings like cattle." The crowd's murmur grew to a roar. Someone threw a stone that shattered the medical facility's window. Another voice shouted about the children who had died, about the graves on the hillside, about the families destroyed by his experiments. Engelhardt raised his pistol, pointing it at Elizabeth. "You ignorant woman! You would have condemned your children to poverty and ignorance. I gave them purpose. Their suffering serves the advancement of human knowledge. In 100 years, my work will be vindicated." It was William who acted. As Engelhardt's finger tightened on the trigger, William threw himself forward, knocking his mother aside. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Sarah screamed and ran to him, pressing her hands against the wound as blood seeped between her fingers. The sight of blood broke something in the crowd. They surged forward as one, overwhelming Engelhardt's assistants. Engelhardt himself retreated into the medical facility, barricading the door, but the settlers had become a mob. They broke through using axes from the workshop, finding Engelhardt in his laboratory, surrounded by his charts and specimens and the preserved remains of malformed infants in glass jars. What happened next would be debated in court documents for years. Engelhardt, cornered and desperate, had apparently prepared for this moment. He had rigged the laboratory with containers of chloroform and ether, chemicals that, when combined and ignited, would create a devastating fire. Whether he intended to destroy the evidence or take everyone with him remains unknown. The explosion could be heard in Lancaster, 15 miles away. The medical facility erupted in flames that shot 50 feet into the air, consuming not just the building, but all of Engelhardt's records, his specimens, his life's work. Engelhardt himself was found in the ruins, burned beyond recognition, identified only by the melted remains of his pocket watch. The fire at Harmonia Springs burned for 2 days. By the time the Lancaster Fire Brigade arrived, there was nothing to save of the medical facility. But the settlers had acted quickly to preserve what evidence they could. Led by Sarah and Elizabeth, they had broken into Engelhardt's office before the fire spread, rescuing documents, ledgers, and the terrible genealogical charts that revealed the full scope of the experiment. County authorities arrived on the morning of April 18, 1871, to find a community in ruins. Not just physically, though the medical facility was destroyed and several houses had caught fire, but spiritually and emotionally. The survivors sat in family groups, some weeping, others staring silently at nothing. Children with visible deformities clung to parents who now understood the terrible truth of their conditions. The initial investigation was led by Judge Harrison Fulton of the Lancaster County Court. A veteran of such proceedings, he thought himself prepared for anything. But as the evidence was presented, the forged documents, the purchased children, the deliberately arranged incestuous marriages, even he was shaken. His preliminary report to the state authorities in Harrisburg used words like unconscionable, monstrous, and beyond the pale of human decency. William survived his gunshot wound, though his left arm would never fully function again. As he recovered, he and Sarah faced the impossible question of what to do with their marriage, their family, their lives. They were husband and wife, but they were also brother and sister. They had 3 living children, Thomas, now 12, whose deformities made him an object of stares wherever he went, and 2 younger children whose conditions were only slightly less severe. Sarah had lost the baby she was carrying, the trauma of the revelations causing her to miscarry. The legal ramifications were complex. Technically, the marriages performed at Harmonia Springs were invalid, being between siblings, but dissolving them would bastardize the children, leaving them with even less protection under the law. Judge Fulton, in what he would later call the most difficult decision of his career, ruled that the marriages would stand legally, though couples were free to separate if they chose. Most did. The financial web that had supported Englehart's experiment began to unravel. Investigation revealed that he had been receiving funding from a shadowy network of wealthy eugenicists, including several prominent Philadelphia businessmen and at least 1 state senator. These men had believed that creating a purified white American bloodline was essential to the nation's future, and they had been willing to fund Englehart's experiments on poor German and Irish families who they saw as expendable. The scandal threatened to reach the highest levels of Pennsylvania society. 3 separate congressional inquiries were launched, but each was mysteriously disbanded before reaching conclusions. Documents disappeared from court archives. Witnesses recanted their testimony or simply vanished. The state senator involved died suddenly of what was officially listed as a heart attack, though his family physician had declared him in perfect health just days before. By the end of 1871, Harmonia Springs was a ghost town. The families had scattered, most changing their names and moving to other states where their histories were unknown. The Zimmermans went west to Illinois. The Yoders disappeared into the growing German community of Wisconsin. The Weavers were rumored to have gone to Canada. Each family carried with them the terrible secret of what had been done to them and what they had unknowingly done to their children. Sarah and William, after much agonizing, decided to separate. They could not continue as husband and wife knowing they were siblings, but they also couldn't entirely sever their connection. William went to Ohio, where he found work as a carpenter under an assumed name. Sarah took the children and moved to Baltimore, where Elizabeth had contacts in the textile industry. They told people she was a war widow, which explained both the children's father's absence and their deformities, which could be attributed to the hardships of war. Thomas Brennan died in 1874, just 15 years old. His body, twisted by the genetic anomalies caused by his parents' relationship, simply gave out. He was buried in a Baltimore cemetery under the name Thomas Graber, his mother's maiden name. His headstone bore only his name and dates, no mention of parents or family. Sarah stood at his grave with Elizabeth, both women weeping for the grandson and son who had never had a chance at a normal life. The other children faced similar fates. Most died young, their bodies unable to sustain life with such severe genetic damage. Those who survived into adulthood were often sterile, nature's way of preventing the continuation of the genetic harm. They lived quiet, hidden lives, many in institutions or cared for by religious orders, who asked no questions about their origins. Daniel and Rebecca, the teenage siblings who had discovered their relationship in time, were perhaps the luckiest. They were taken in by a Quaker family in Philadelphia who knew their story, but believed in redemption and second chances. They grew up as acknowledged siblings, both eventually marrying others and having healthy children. But they never spoke of Harmonia Springs, and their children never knew the horror their parents had narrowly escaped. Elizabeth Brennan lived until 1878, spending her final years caring for Sarah and the surviving grandchildren. On her deathbed, she made Sarah promise to document everything, to ensure that the truth of Harmonia Springs would not be entirely lost. Sarah kept that promise, writing a detailed account that she placed in a safety deposit box with instructions that it not be opened for 50 years. In 1921, when that box was finally opened, The world had changed. Eugenics was no longer a fringe theory, but was being embraced by governments worldwide. Sarah's account was dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized woman, the physical evidence long since destroyed or disappeared. It would take the horrors of World War II and the Nazi eugenic programs to make people understand what had happened in that small Pennsylvania valley. Today, Harmonia Springs is just a name on old maps, the settlement long since reclaimed by forest. Hikers occasionally find remnants, a foundation stone, a rusted piece of medical equipment, bones from the hillside cemetery where the markers have long since rotted away. The spring still flows, its mineral-rich water bubbling up from the limestone bedrock, but no one drinks from it. Local legends speak of strange cries heard at night, of misshapen shadows seen moving through the trees, of a curse upon the land. The truth, as always, is more terrible than any legend. Harmonia Springs was not cursed by supernatural forces, but by human ambition, by the belief that science could perfect humanity through controlled breeding, by the willingness of powerful men to experiment on the powerless. The children who died there, the families destroyed, the lives ruined. They were sacrifices on the altar of a twisted vision of human perfection. In the National Archives in Washington, locked in a section requiring special clearance to access, sit 3 boxes of documents related to Harmonia Springs. They include Sarah's journal, fragments of Englehart's notes that survived the fire, court testimonies, and photographs. Terrible photographs of the children born from those forced unions. The boxes are marked with a simple notation: restricted until 2071, national security. What makes this story truly horrifying is not that it happened, but that it was not unique. Research has uncovered references to similar experiments in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, all connected to the same network of eugenicists who funded Englehart. How many other Harmonia Springs existed? How many other families were destroyed in the name of hereditary optimization? How many other Dr. Engleharts practiced their terrible science on the desperate and vulnerable? The last known survivor of Harmonia Springs died in 1943. She was Margaret Yoder, born Margaret Stoltzfus, one of the few children born there without severe deformities. She had spent her life in a Catholic convent in Maryland, never speaking of her origins. But on her deathbed, she told her story to a young nun who wrote it down and hid it in the convent's archives. That account confirms Sarah's journal in every particular, adding details that make the horror even more complete. According to Margaret, there were more settlements, more experiments, more children born of brothers and sisters who never knew their true relationship. She spoke of correspondence she had seen as a child, letters from doctors in other states comparing their results, discussing their failures and successes in breeding human beings like livestock. She remembered Englehart showing visitors jars containing preserved fetuses, pointing out various deformities as if they were scientific treasures rather than dead children. She also revealed that some of the families who fled Harmonia Springs were tracked down by agents of the eugenics network. Some were paid to remain silent, others simply disappeared. The Zimmerman family, who had gone to Illinois, were found dead in their farmhouse in 1873, all of them poisoned. It was ruled a murder-suicide, but Margaret knew better. They had been talking about going to the newspapers, about exposing what had been done to them. The full truth of Harmonia Springs may never be known. Too many documents were destroyed, too many witnesses silenced, too many powerful people had too much to lose if the extent of the experiments became public. But what we do know is enough. Between 1856 and 1871, at least 40 families were subjected to deliberate genetic experimentation. At least 20 couples were tricked into marrying their own siblings. At least 60 children were born with severe genetic deformities as a result. And this was just one settlement, one doctor, one experiment. The last piece of evidence regarding Harmonia Springs surfaced in 1995 when a construction crew building a new highway through Lancaster County uncovered a mass grave. The remains of 17 children were found, all showing signs of severe genetic abnormalities. DNA testing confirmed they were all related, all products of incestuous unions. The state quietly reburied them in an unmarked grave, the location known only to a few officials. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was a letter found in the estate of a prominent Philadelphia family in 2003. Written by Engelhardt shortly before his death, it spoke of his work as merely the beginning. "The seed has been planted," he wrote. "Others will continue what I have started. The purification of the American bloodline is too important to be stopped by the squeamishness of the ignorant. In time, my methods will be vindicated, my vision realized." Harmonia Springs was not an ending, but a beginning. What do you think really happened at Harmonia Springs? Was it an isolated incident of medical madness or part of something larger that we still don't fully understand? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story has chilled you to the bone, please share it with someone else who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to hear more suppressed stories from America's past. Remember, the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural beings, but human beings with power and twisted visions of perfection. Until next time, this has been Liturgy of Fear, reminding you that some secrets are buried for a reason.